It's Friday, February 21st, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, long live the king. Donald Trump declares himself a king, and Republicans are more than happy to bend the knee. My guest this week is the distinguished professor of democracy at the University of Toronto, Lucan, who co-wrote a new piece for Foreign Affairs magazine called The American Path to Authoritarianism. We talk about this really important piece, how the U.S. is backsliding its way into authoritarianism, and what happens next. But first, here are your headlines. On Tuesday, the Vatican announced Pope Francis, who had been in the hospital since last week for bronchitis, was also being treated for pneumonia, a troubling development for the 88-year-old Pope. The Vatican said on Thursday he was improving slightly, but they also said his condition was complex. Now, in the past, the Pope has not been known to be a great hospital patient. He likes being active, he likes to meet people, and right now he's supposed to be getting as much rest as possible. Despite the Vatican's statement about Francis's improvement, several cardinals who are high-ranking members in the Catholic Church brought up the possibility of Pope Francis resigning because he has not been able to do his daily duties to the nearly 1.4 billion Catholics around the world. The Vatican has not addressed those concerns directly yet. Now, the Pope's hospitalization has brought thousands of Catholics to Rome, St. Peter's Square, and the hospital itself where the Pope is being treated. It's more than the city of Rome was expecting during a year in which 35 million Catholics were already expected to visit because of a year-long jubilee of forgiveness that only happens once every 50 years. On Wednesday, Delta Airlines began offering passengers who were aboard the flight that flipped upside down on its landing $30,000. The flight was flying from Minneapolis to Toronto, and passengers said the plane, as it was landing, skidded and then flipped upside down, leaving them dangling from their seats and then having to drop down and be pushed out onto the tarmac in freezing temperatures as first responders sprayed down the plane to make sure that it didn't catch fire or burst into flames. By some miracle, all 80 of the people on board, passengers and crew, survived. 21 were taken to the hospital, and as I'm recording this, all but one had been released, according to the reports that I could find. Now, when it comes to that $30,000 offer, Delta says there are no strings attached, but lawyers and legal scholars are telling passengers to be cautious. Companies like Delta don't just do things for the sake of goodwill. Strings will most definitely be attached, even if they aren't right away. But this crash does definitely make me think I should pay a little more attention to that pre-flight demonstration by the flight attendants before takeoff the next time I'm on a plane. Now, on Thursday, there were two big pieces of news out of the U.S. Senate. The first, longtime leader of the party, Mitch McConnell, said he was not running for re-election next year, signaling the end of an era in Republican politics. McConnell is the Senate's third oldest member at 83 years old, behind Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who's only a couple months older than him, and Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley, who is 91 years old. Now, McConnell's retirement, he's a Republican from Kentucky, by the way, it was not entirely unexpected. He's had some health issues in recent years, including stumbling and falling on multiple occasions, stopping mid-speech for concerning amounts of time, and the occasional mystery bruise or bandage that he wouldn't explain. He was also most recently on the outs with his own party, particularly after January 6th. He was also the lone holdout on several key nominations and appointments for Trump this time around, including RFK Jr. and Pete Hegseth. But McConnell's real legacy will be how he reshaped the American judiciary and the power in the Senate and of the Senate. For decades, he used his position in the Senate to appoint the most conservative judges and justices and to block democratically appointed ones, while also breaking long-held rules and norms in the Senate that, up until McConnell was in there, were really seen as almost sacred. And that is going to be his legacy, just how he was able to wield the power of the positions that he was in. Also on Thursday, the Senate confirmed Trump super loyalist Kash Patel to be the head of the FBI. The vote was 51-49, with two Republican senators crossing party lines. Those were Senator Susan Collins from Maine and Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. Now, despite saying in his confirmation hearing that he does not have a hit list of Trump's enemies that he was going to go after with the full force of the FBI, Trump's Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who has the power to direct FBI investigations, says she wants to prosecute Trump's opponents, and Patel has said on a number of occasions that he wants to use the FBI to go after not just political opponents, but also dissenters and detractors of Trump, too. Here he is saying that on a far-right outlet not that long ago.
We will go out and find the conspirators, not just in government, but in the media. Yes, we're going to come after the people in the media who lied about American citizens, who helped Joe Biden rig presidential elections. We're going to come after you. Whether it's criminally or civilly, we'll figure that out. But yeah, we're putting you on.
Now, Patel is also deeply compromised. We learned in the run-up to his confirmation that he has investments in foreign countries and companies, including the Chinese-owned fast fashion company Shein, to the tune of several $1 million. Now, Patel says he will not be divesting from those things, and ethics and national security experts warn that that kind of money, those investments, could lead to foreign influence over Patel and the way the FBI is run. He also lied about having those investments to the Senate, who confirmed him anyway. And finally, and also on Thursday, the Canadian national hockey team beat the U.S. national team in the first-ever Four Nations Face-Off tournament. The final game was held in Boston, and the Canadians won a thrilling overtime game, 3-2. Now, as a Minnesota boy, hockey is practically the only winter pastime I grew up with, so while I was excited to see a really good game, I wish it had gone differently. The game was also, and this is really the big narrative out of it, it was set against the backdrop of Trump's threats to either invade Canada or to somehow make it the 51st state, his follow-through of putting steep tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, and a lot of online accounts sharing the idea that the U.S. and Canada might somehow go to war. Now, Canadian generals have said that it is not a possibility, but NATO allies, which are supposed to be allies of the U.S. too, and vice versa, have been quietly urging Canada to be ready for a conventional war, a lot like World War II, something where we have soldiers on the ground, or Canadians have soldiers on the ground, though not explicitly saying where or if fighting could actually take place. It's more just a be ready kind of a thing, which still isn't a comforting thought, but it isn't that we're going to see Canadian Mounties crossing a U.S. border. Okay, that is it for your headlines. Let's get to today's main topic: who died and made Trump king anyway? Earlier this week, Donald Trump posted on social media, "Congestion pricing is dead, Manhattan and all of New York is saved, long live the king." What he's talking about here is he wants to move to end the congestion tax in New York City that New York passed. That means drivers in the city would have to pay an extra fee to have their cars there. It's an idea to help improve traffic, make New York a little more walkable, a little safer for pedestrians, and to have more people use public transportation. The problems with the MTA and the subway in New York right now are a different thing. It's important to note here that Trump hasn't actually done anything, and he also likely won't win in court because the federal government isn't allowed to affect local laws like these, but he could do things like withholding funding or extort the city somehow, kind of like he's already doing with Eric Adams and immigration. It's the stuff I talked about last week. But that really wasn't the part that people are focusing on. It was the part about him being a king. And I know that this is the shiny object and that it's meant to get the attention of journalists like me, raise the ire of Democrats, and generally just troll people with the latest thing he said online. But also, at the same time, it isn't. At the same time, this is how Trump operates. He floats little test balloons that become lines sprinkled in here and there at speeches and rallies and press conferences, and then it becomes actual parts of real policies. Think when he said he wanted to be a dictator on day one, or when he says he wants a third term. Those things start out as jokes and trolling, but he's also kind of glancing around to see if those things are getting any traction. He's nothing if not a politician who is maybe a once-in-a-generation talent for Republicans for having a finger on the pulse of his followers. But it wasn't that he just said it, right? It was that so many people came after to back him up. There was an official post from the White House that used an AI-generated image that was supposed to be a Time magazine cover that said Trump on the top. It was an oil painting-looking picture of Trump in a crown, standing against the backdrop of New York with the phrase, "Long live the king," in a corner. The White House Deputy Chief of Staff posted an AI image of her own, of Trump in a full royal dress, the crown, the white leopard trim, the velvet blue cape, and a lot of brooches, The AI was very concerned about the number of brooches Trump would be wearing. But anyway, then there was a simple post from the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt that was just the 100% emoji over Trump calling himself a king. This also, by the way, wasn't even the first time someone has called Trump a king. Kash Patel, the guy who's going to run our FBI now, wrote a children's book called The Plot Against the King about the FBI investigation into whether Russia helped Trump's 2016 campaign, Trump there obviously being King Trump. Again, I know that this statement and these reactions to it are meant to distract and drive a news cycle, but it also came on the heels of him posting just a few days before the quote, "He who saves his country does not violate any law." The words country and law are capitalized there, but I don't think they have any meaning other than Trump's loose grasp on grammar. But the quote is misattributed to Napoleon often, a man who seized power through a dictatorial coup in Europe in 1804, and then crowned himself emperor of Europe. And the idea of the law being part of the man, or vice versa, the man as the law, is something Trump and Republicans have been trying to make part of the presidency for quite a while, but really strongly in the last few years, up into that Supreme Court case that I talked about last week, where presidents have now near full immunity for the things they do in office. And now, I'm not going to bore you with the political science stuff here, ideas about sovereignty or where power actually lives, whether it's a single ruler, the laws, or the people. But to make a long idea short here, every authoritarian, every dictator, and every monarch who ever rose to power has always had a moment like this where they claim that they are the law, that because what they're doing is so righteous, or that they were elected and therefore speak for all people, that means they can't actually break the laws because it's the will of the people, and in fact, it's the rule of law that's wrong. That's the exact idea that we heard from Elon Musk and have been hearing from him, in which he sent out on X, if the will of the president is not implemented and the president is representative of the people, that means the will of the people is not being implemented. So that's not really how this works. The power of the people isn't solely tied up in the president. In fact, the Constitution makes that pretty clear, and it makes it pretty clear that it's actually the House of Representatives that's the closest to the will of the people. That's why we have elections in the House every 2 years. But that's not really the point, because since Trump said he was king, we've seen Republicans rush to bend the knee and genuflect. One of those places we've seen it was at CPAC this week, which is the Conservative Political Action Conference. Now, for decades, CPAC was this pretty boring convention where the nerdiest people in conservative politics would meet to talk policy, lobby, or interest groups would go to pitch whatever their cause was. It was really only important to dweebs like me who follow this stuff at the nitty-gritty level. And, it still kind of is, but it really has changed over the last 15 years and really changed since Trump got elected. It's now a much more fiery and extreme convention. It used to be attended by what we would consider traditional Republicans, former leaders, former members of Congress, members of groups like LGBTQ groups spoke at these events, and even a few moderate Democrats would be on stages or panels for conservative ideas. And that has gone away, and it's given way to real extremists like Steve Bannon, who was on stage this week and floated the idea, again, of giving Trump a third term.
And the future of MAGA is Donald J. Trump. We want Trump in 28. That's what they can't stand. A man like Trump comes along only once or twice in a country's history, right? We want Trump. We want Trump.
And then Bannon went on to give a Nazi salute. I don't know what else to call it. He extended his arm straight out after saying, fight, fight, fight. It's unambiguous. It's not even close to having any of the cover that Elon Musk's salute did. Those of you watching, here it is.
And we're not going to retreat. We're not going to surrender. We're not going to quit. Fight, fight, fight. Amen.
The phrase, if I had a nickel for every time one of these guys did a Nazi salute, I'd have 2 nickels, but that's still pretty weird, right? Anyway, among the groups that are at CPAC now is a new one also pushing for a third term for Trump, which is being run in part by a guy named Shane Trejo, who considers himself to be a libertarian nationalist who was a party official for the Michigan Republican Party, co-ran a neo-Nazi podcast called Blood, Soil, and Liberty, which echoes a very common Nazi phrase, blood and soil. That podcast is still up, by the way. He also has ties to a number of white supremacist groups and has defended those groups in the past. Trejo's new group is called the Third Term Project and is meant to support the bill to amend the Constitution to allow presidents to have 3 terms or an unlimited amount of terms, and that was brought by a congressman from Kentucky, Andy Ogles. Now, there are lots of ways that this effort and this bill will fail, mostly because it's incredibly hard to amend the Constitution. You need 2/3 vote in Congress, you need 2/3 approval then from the states to ratify that, or you need 2/3 of states to call for a constitutional convention, and then 2/3 of states to approve whatever change was made to the Constitution at that convention. In our political world right now, it just isn't a thing that is going to happen, but it's important to know that there is a push to do it. Because as Trejo puts it, limiting the president to 2 terms wasn't done until the 20th century, after FDR in the 1940s, which he says means, quote, if we're talking about the original intent of the Constitution and what the Founding Fathers wanted, which is generally what conservatives support, then, presidential term limits were not part of it. So we reject the constitutional argument. And that's the thing about all of this. Trump calling himself a king or saying that he and the law are all the same. It's all a rejection of the Constitution, not an embracing of it. Now, for one thing here, sole rulers, they need high approval ratings for the things that they're doing and want to do. And this week, as Trump was calling himself a king and not quoting but quoting Napoleon, we got our first bit of polling, which shows our wannabe emperor might not have any clothes. So this new poll was from Ipsos and the Washington Post. Ipsos is one of the best polling firms in the country and found that Trump and what he's been doing is actually really unpopular. The first question is Trump's approval rating right now, and he isn't cracking 50%. He's just 45% of people said they approved of the job he was doing. 53% said they didn't. On Trump personally, the numbers weren't great there either. Nearly 2/3 of Americans said Trump wasn't honest or trustworthy, and 50% said he didn't have the mental sharpness to do the job. Something that is really going to get under his skin, especially after we saw that Elon Musk press conference where Trump took a back seat and it really seemed like he didn't have control. Now, people have always said those things about Trump's personality or his sharpness, but they still vote for him anyway because of the issues. But let's look at those things. When it came to his 3 big topics, Trump said he'd tackle the economy, immigration, and reshaping the federal government, but people disapproved of his handling of the economy and the federal government by double digits or nearly double digits, and he only had 50% approval on immigration, so barely a majority and certainly not a staggeringly high mandate number either. And then came the really bad numbers in this poll for Donald Trump, because there wasn't a single piece of Trump or Doge's agenda that was popular with Americans. It wasn't banning trans Americans from the military, not shutting down U.S. agencies like USAID that help poor people in other countries. It wasn't stopping scientific research or science communication, not pardoning the January 6th attackers. All of those things were disapproved of by between 11 points at their tightest or 69 points for the January 6th pardons, which had 83% disapproval ratings. The only issue that was asked about that didn't get above 50% disapproval was ending DEIA programs, and that was still more disliked, 49 to 53. So the argument here that Donald Trump, by being elected, embodies the will of the people and can be a sole ruler doesn't hold a lot of water against these numbers. But it won't stop his agenda or his supporters from moving forward, which brings us to my conversation today with Lucan. He's a distinguished professor of democracy from the University of Toronto and the co-author of the article, The Path to American Authoritarianism, What Comes After a Democratic Breakdown. It is required reading right now for making the last month make some sense, and I am so excited for you to hear our conversation. I read this piece, and I was really excited that you said yes to this, because for me, this piece was chillingly the most important, I think, piece that we've seen like this about this sort of takeover. I've done a lot of the talking about Elon Musk and the movements that he's doing, which I think are also related to the things we're talking about here too. But just it's just so methodical in a way, the way that you lay this out. And I want to ask about the breakdowns in other countries, because you just mentioned, Hungary, you look at what happened in Poland, India, Turkey, which I think the Turkish one is kind of interesting given the stuff with Eric Adams right now too. But are we a model one-to-one on top of those, or is it more Russian in a sense, or is it just too early to tell?
Bottom line, it's too early to tell, but I think that what is, again, shocking is that, if Steve and I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs in 2022 in which we basically argued that the more likely outcome in the United States was instability rather than consolidated authoritarianism, which I still think actually, by the way, holds. But basically, again, the model was very much sort of a Hungarian model, at least sort of. Our thought in 2022 was that the Hungarians had it much easier. You had a much weaker private sector. You have, a democracy that had only been around for 25 years, and so, Orban just had a much easier time transitioning to authoritarianism than Trump does. But now again, given the degree of illegality, I feel like we're kind of inching towards a kind of Putin-style scenario in a way that is genuinely shocking.
The most striking, I think, for me, sentence from this piece, which is U.S. democracy will likely break down during the second Trump administration, in the sense that it will cease to meet standard criteria for liberal democracy, full adult suffrage, free and fair elections, and broad protections of civil liberties. Which, when we talk about these big things, the end of certain suffrage for people, the right to vote, free and fair elections, and then actually let's stop with those two, because there was an interesting part of this that it's a thing that I think about a lot when I talk about politics and elections, is that these things are run at local levels. So how does the playbook work, I should say, to tilt elections in the way that you're talking about?
So as we lay out in the piece, I think the playbook is fairly straightforward, which is that you have powerful institutions such as the FBI, the Department of Justice, the IRS, that can be used to make life hell for anybody who is seen, as seen as being anti-Trump. And fortunately in the United States, knock on wood, we still have a very robust criminal justice system. So it's hard to imagine a kind of Putin-style scenario where people are either assassinated or in jail. But there's a lot of bad short of that. You can really make someone's life hell. You can deplete their life savings, and increase their stress very easily. I mean, it is barely move a pinky, and the FBI can do this. And this is yesterday we had the Cash Patel,
Yeah.
and so this is. I mean, I think there have been a lot of awful appointments. The Cash Patel appointment is really a Rubicon. I mean, you're sort of more than, in my mind, than anything else. I mean, you take the most powerful law enforcement agency and you give it over to someone who's, explicitly out to sort of target Trump's rivals. I mean, this brings the United States into unambiguously authoritarian, territory.
He's got a list. He put it in the back of a book he wrote. It's there. It's in print and sold a bunch of copies. It's there. And listeners will have just heard him talk about that and then lie about it in his Senate confirmation hearing.
Yeah.
Before our conversation.
Absolutely. So, right. So so that's yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what else is there to add to that.
Right. Right. In that same idea, I'm also curious about the notion of the chilling effect on things like media corporations and corporations writ large, because of the way that you describe, how American society is set up, where you've got sort of a large decentralized private sector that's different from other ways we've seen authoritarians rise in other countries that are much smaller. Although later I do want to talk about the size of the U.S. too in some of this, but I'm very curious about this, duality of the chilling effect, but also the honey traps that are being laid out for these corporations, and you can absolutely see that in things like Meta. You can see it in things like Amazon and the Washington Post, the LA Times. The publisher there is a medical device billionaire. How do we recognize those things as they're happening? I think the chilling effect will be pretty easy to see, but maybe the honey traps are a little bit slower.
A strong private sector is core to democratic development. You need a strong private sector for opposition, for the development of independent media. But partly the way that capitalism has developed in the United States is that these media companies are sort of embedded in these much larger corporate networks, which are in turn incredibly vulnerable to pressure, by the executive. So there's just numerous points of vulnerability that they're exposed to that we're now seeing the impact of. So it's just extraordinarily easy for Trump to sort of bat an eye and do things that will clearly harm, the profitability of these major companies, from Amazon in terms of major government contracts to, the owner of the LA Times, sort of, medical devices and stuff that are, in front of the FDA and stuff. They're just to mergers, by Paramount, which controls CBS. I mean, there's just so many points of vulnerability that, these are kind of structural things that are there in place for a long time. And in a sense, what's shocking is I sort of, Steve and I were talking about this, is that, why hasn't someone done this in the past? It's so easy.
I think for me, that is the thing that I've had the most trouble reconciling, or the thing that I've been struggling with the most as we've watched these last 30 days roll out, is that I'm shocked by how easy it has been to do some of this stuff. I am shocked at how little pushback there's been, and that things that we thought were so concrete end up just being sort of like an honor system. Although, is that kind of the thing that people who slide into authoritarianism like this, competitive authoritarianism, bank on? Is that how this works?
So I think it's worthwhile emphasizing that, we're still in the kind of shock and awe stage, and you wouldn't necessarily expect within a month for the opposition to remobilize, and for the it's certainly not enough time for the legal system to respond. So I do think it's important to be cognizant of it. I mean, but nonetheless, this is the United States, man. This isn't Ukraine in the 1990s, or Russia in the early 2000s, or even Turkey or Hungary, which per capita income in Hungary is half of what it is in the United States. I mean, this was a substantially wealthier, more developed capitalist economy with century more of democratic experience.
Does that mean that things will move faster or slower, do you think, because of the wealth, or because of the longer erosion of some of these democratic things? Or is it slower because of the wealth and the size of the country and the economy and the strength of a century or 250 years of this democratic rule?
I mean, I think basically, I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm still optimistic that they will not be able to consolidate this.
There was a thing that I was thinking as I was reading your piece again this morning, is that, and while we're talking about this, is there a fatigue element that happens to these sort of movements? The people who support them just get tired of the people like Musk, like Trump. There is a phenomenon that happens with Trump where you talk to people who say, well, I like this stuff he says, but I don't like him, and I don't like the way he says it. And that sort of cult of personality seems to have been shrinking over the last few years. Is there a fatigue to this where you start to get people who maybe don't fully support, but also don't sideline themselves either? Although I don't know what good that is.
Well, I think it is good. I mean, in a sense, I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think, I mean, the problem is that, United States is so polarized that, and party identification is almost like a religion, that, even if they don't like Trump. I mean, that was true in the 2024 election, that, a lot of people who didn't like Trump hated the Democrats much more. So it's not clear. I mean, even if you have a weakening of the cult of personality, it's not immediately clear what benefit that it gives the Democrats, given just the sort of nature of polarization. That they're just, I mean, the only thing actually where it could matter, where I think it is in turnout. So, part of the reason why Trump has been so successful is he brings out the rural vote in a way that no one else has done. And certainly that's where the vulnerability is. These guys will probably almost never vote for a Democrat, but given how close a lot of these races are, sort of a slight dip in turnout is going to hurt him. And in the way that it really hurt us, the Democrats in 2024.
But before I let you go, I do want to ask about your thoughts on J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth in Europe. Obviously, it ties into some of these things that we have been talking about. For you, how damaging was this trip to not just American democracy, but the idea of liberal democracy abroad?
How do I say this? I actually think, well, that and Riyadh, where is in some ways much worse in its long-term impact than what we've just been talking about.
Break that down for listeners a little bit here.
So basically, the post-war, after World War II, post-war stability was based in a kind of quasi-rules-based order, like lots of problems with this rule-based order, lots of exceptions, blah, blah, blah. But roughly did important things, which is it stopped countries from invading one another. Not too long ago, a few hundred years ago, countries were almost constantly at war with one another over territory, over wars of conquest, right? In early modern France, I think France was at war 85% of the time. I mean, and so, the post-war order ended that. people, countries didn't have to worry about defending their borders as much, and were able to focus on economic development and providing for the welfare of their societies.
Right. The European Coal and Steel Commission or whatever it was.
Yeah, the
right?
European Union, exactly.
Yes.
And so, but now you have the world's most powerful military essentially on the side of dictatorship and imperialism. So that is done. And I think people who think that this is only going to hurt Ukraine are just insanely naive and lack imagination of how this is. I think what we're seeing is incredibly ugly development that I think will sort of, in some ways, could ultimately, the stuff that run democracy in the United States could almost seem like a small sideshow compared to the fact that we're going to be constantly at war. Because Putin is not the only dictator with territorial designs on a neighbor. And so this really opens the floodgates. It's incredibly escalatory. And Europe, with what you mentioned with Vance, siding with the far right. It is hard to see how this ends well, except if, I think the German elections, you could see, hopefully the CDU will gain power. And I think they're in a much, better position to sort of much more willing to arm Germany. But, it really kind of, everything rests on the Europeans. But I mean, it's funny when I've studied Eastern Europe for close to 30 years now. And I always tell, one thing you learn about studying Eastern Europe is that things can always get worse. And so, it's very hard, and so, so in some ways, I think your question is very apropos in the sense that I think that, internationally, that kind of historically in a broad history, that may be the kind of what we remember the most.
Yeah. Is this sort of the Americans going to Europe and saying we're switching sides and we're giving a permission slip to want to start breaching borders?
So imagine that FDR had supported Hitler.
What a note to leave this on, Lucan.
Yeah.
But really, thank you so much for doing this. And I'm going to link to the article in the show notes for this because
Great.
It really is, I think, the most important thing that people should be reading right now.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Now it's time for TLTO, or Too Long, Tuned Out, where I tell you just the stuff you need to know from the stuff you just heard. Donald Trump, earlier this week, declared himself to be a king. Now, was it partly trolling to get under the skin of Democrats and to distract journalists? Absolutely. Is it also part of a troubling trend of Trump wanting to consolidate as much power in himself as possible? Absolutely. And Republicans and his own White House are backing up those ideas. AI images of Trump as a king went out, and at the biggest convention of conservatives in the country, there are pushes to have Trump be elected to a third term. Again, are those things likely going to happen? No, but it's just the push to have those things there that is anti-democratic. On top of it, we got our first polling numbers back for the first month of Trump's presidency, and he's not in good shape. Trump is unpopular as a person and as a leader, and most of the biggest moves that he's made outside of immigration have been wildly disliked by the American public. And that is it for today's episode. I want to thank Lucan again for coming on the show. If you want a link to that article in Foreign Affairs, I've got that in the show notes here, plus a link to the other great work that he is doing right now at the University of Toronto. And as always, rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you listen to this on. Like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new videos. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack. It's just $5 a month for the lowest tier of paid subscribers. It helps me be able to keep this thing going, and you get a bunch of bonus content, including daily articles, the most recent one, keeping track of Trump's cases around immigration. It's the latest in a series of how I'm tracking all of these court cases. You can go back and read all of those, and I'm updating those as the cases change. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Granthermes on X and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you next week.